everybody. It's good to almost virtually see you again. I know that a lot of you probably have questions about when we will be starting the physical programs again and when you might be able to come to tea and books in the library again. You're probably aware that the library has moved into stage 3 now, so we still have shortened library hours, but you can come into the library now. You can browse the shelf and pick out books. We're not at this point really encouraging people to spend a lot of time there, but if you need to use a computer, you can book it for 45 minutes. So we do have a lot of our services back, and we will be having a show in the gallery soon at the end of September. However, the actual physical programs, due to an abundance of caution on our side and recommendations from the health department, we're trying to avoid any sort of activities that are going to bring a lot of people into the library at one time. We still have some limitations around the number of people who can be in the building, and we want to keep all of you safe, and we especially want to keep our staff safe so they can continue serving you. So we're probably going to continue a version of online programs until the end of 2020. I know that's probably not great news, but I just want to let you know that for the time being, we will be looking at different things that we can do in the library that don't bring a whole lot of people into the building. So we're trying to think of some interesting things that can happen, but an actual whole bunch of people sitting around in a room is probably not going to happen until 2021, depending on how everything goes up till the end of the year. So I just thought I would open with that. Hello, everybody, anybody who's just joined us. I wanted to tell you that today my tea is Blackberry Jasmine Blast. So I haven't had a sip yet. It's very intense smelling. It's from David's Tea. Oh, it's nice. Very nice. Very fragrant, very fruity, a little bit floral. So feel free to let me know in the comments what tea you're drinking, or if you're drinking something else, that's fine too. You don't have to share if you don't want. So today I have 3 books for you, 2 fiction and a non-fiction. And this first one that I'm going to talk about today, I just found such a delightful read. It's called All Adults Here by Emma Straub. So if you haven't read this one already, I would really recommend it. It sort of deals with one of my favorite subjects in life, which is adult children and their adult parents. I have a lot of friends, even in their 50s, that I've seen have a lot of trouble when their parents, widowed parents, start dating again or something like that. And it's something I've always interested in exploring, that idea of adult children and who they are and what they think their parents owe them. And it's just, I find it a very interesting and possibly humorous, certainly in this book, humorous subject. So our heroine in this book is Astrid, and Astrid is 68 years old, and Astrid is a very I was going to say uptight, but that sounds negative. She's a very controlled individual. She was a very controlled parent, and she is not a person. She's very no-nonsense, very... The book is set in the States, but it felt like Britain to me because Astrid strikes me as a very British character. She's very stiff upper lip. She doesn't like nonsense. And the book opens with her seeing, she lives in this small town, and she sees one of the women who lives in the town get hit by a bus and killed, almost right in front of her. And in fact, she's about to cross the street, and this happens. And had the other woman not gotten in the way when she did, it's quite possible that it could have been Astrid that got hit by the bus. And this starts Astrid thinking about how little time she has left. So Astrid has 3 adult children, 2 sons. Her sons are Elliot and Nikki, and a daughter named Porter. And Elliot is the eldest, and he's married to Wendy, and they have 2 little boys. And Elliot and Wendy are, I think of them as the archetypal sort of 80s yuppies. You know, they're very professional, very controlled, very, you know. And Porter is, you know, she lives on a goat farm. She makes goat cheese. She's single as far as her mother knows. It doesn't look likely that she's going to be getting married. And so Porter's an interesting character, but she tends to be the really emotional, dramatic one. And then Nikki is the youngest, and Nikki is much beloved of his mother, but he's always been very charming, very easygoing, and sort of always trying to get away. So he moved away quite young. He got married to Juliet, and they're both sort of more artistic bohemian types, and they have a daughter, Cecilia. So at the beginning of the book, Cecilia has been sent to stay with her grandmother, Astrid. Cecilia is a high school student, and she's been, her parents sent her away at a very bad time for Cecilia, because Cecilia had just been through sort of a drama at school that had gotten her, well, let's just say, because I don't want to give too much away, that she had basically become very unpopular with her peers over an action that she took. And her parents, rather than helping her out with it, sent her away. So I'm going to read a little bit to you. It might be a bit of a longer passage because I'm going to read from the section that talks about the kids a little bit, so you get an understanding of Astrid's relationship with her kids and who each of the kids are. So Astrid has invited all of the kids to come for brunch because she has an announcement that she wants to make to them that she's decided it's time to make, because she's 68, she saw this woman die, and she's thinking of her own death, and she figures, you know, she might as well be open with her family at this point. And it's just very interesting how her adult children each react to it. Although I don't think Nikki's here, but his daughter Cecilia is staying with her. Sometimes, when more than one of her children were in the same room, Astrid thought about their father walking in. Their father, her husband Russell, who hadn't made it to the 21st century and who never had a cell phone. Sometimes Astrid thought about that, about Russell traveling to and from his home and office, landline to landline, and it seemed impossibly quaint. She had lived most of her life without one too, of course. She had a flip phone until Cecilia was born, and she understood the pull of always having a camera in her pocket. But Russell never even touched one, she didn't think. One of his college friends, a rich show-off who they occasionally visited in California, had a car phone the size of a shoebox, and it was something that they had laughed about, this hotshot fool who thought what he had to say was so important that he needed to be reachable even in his car. She had a dream about sitting at a restaurant with Bertie and seeing Russell walk by outside and rushing out the door to catch him, but by the time she got outside, he was gone. And it turned out that she was barefoot anyway, and then the restaurant was gone, and she had to walk home. Dreams didn't mean anything. Nicky thought they did, but Nicky had always been so good-looking that he believed all kinds of things that less good-looking people weren't allowed to believe in because people would laugh at them. No one laughed at a gorgeous white man. It was a design flaw in the universe. Before Barbara died, Astrid thought about telling her kids about Bertie, but it never seemed to matter. Now it was time. It was time. They were adults, and so was she. Astrid could say the words. It was 10:20 and no one had arrived yet. Even Cecilia was still in her room, though Astrid heard her clomping overhead. Maybe it wasn't fair to compare daughters-in-law, just like it wasn't fair to compare sons, but Astrid couldn't help it. Children were the people they were from the beginning, and, with the exception of a few social mores, public nose-picking, chanting about poop, rarely changed drastically from toddlerhood on. Nicky had always been a leaf in a river, content to float. His ease in his own skin had made him irresistible to other people all his life. Elliot was the opposite. He tried so hard to be big enough, smart enough, charming enough, that he was none of the three. He was dedicated to the idea of perfection. As a boy, he'd whined for the largest toy, the biggest scoop of ice cream, the starting spot on the JV basketball team, no matter his skill. And both Nicky and Elliot had found partners that they needed. At least, they'd found partners, unlike their poor sister. It felt something like haunting the house of your widower and his new wife to see the needs your children possessed and the people who filled them. Nicky met Juliet at a party, and they were married at City Hall 2 weeks later, their fingers always clutching and unclutching like mating spiders. She was decisive and focused, if self-destructive. She was French. And once Astrid met Juliet, she could see it all, the love affair, the unplanned child, the swan dive into normalcy, the gradual separation, the end. She felt psychic with visions of doom. Never mind that they were still married. They were trying to live some easygoing fantasy concocted in a forest ceremony guided by a crystal. It was hooey, and everyone knew it but them. With Elliot, it was the reverse. Both Elliot and Wendy lived to check the boxes of adulthood. They had an engagement party. They had a wedding with 200 people, 3/4 of them Wendy's enormous Chinese family, and a reception with a costume change halfway through. They had a baby shower, a gender reveal party, and at each one of them, Elliot and Wendy would smile in the exact same way, even and false, their hands light on each other's backs, and Astrid would think, "What the hell?" In some ways, Astrid thought that Wendy was just like her, a perfectionist, and was flattered that Elliot had looked for his mother in some ways, just like the Greeks said. But Wendy's perfection didn't have anything to do with Astrid, not really. She cared about nutrition, not taste. She cared about calories, not exercise. But mothers-in-law don't matter in marriages except as points of contrast. Russell Strick had never understood a single word that Astrid's mother had said, her English both heavy with Romanian and low in her throat, but he had liked her Kasia Varnishkas. His mother had been quiet, a dormouse, and Astrid knew that he liked having a wife who was not afraid to speak. Their mothers were not part of their daily lives as parents. They were not on the rug and their socked feet playing with the children the way grandparents were nowadays, the way Astrid's children expected her to be. Russell had been the softy of the two of them. He would have let Cecilia cover his face with stickers. He would have let the twins use his body as a trampoline. What would Russell have thought about Bertie as his successor in Astrid's bed? He would have liked her. And then he would have handed her his dirty plate to take back to the sink. He wouldn't have understood. Russell was the kind of man who met women who had lived with another for 50 years and thought, "Oh, how nice, roommates." But Astrid herself had changed in the last 20 years. No doubt Russell would have too. That was a melancholy mystery, how his chest hair would have grayed, how he would feel about gender-neutral bathrooms, what he would make of Donald Trump. Some days Astrid felt like she was the same person she'd been when her husband died, but most of the time that person felt like a distant relative, a cousin in another time zone, seen mostly in old photographs wearing unfashionable clothing. The menu was simple: pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs, toast, jam, fresh squeezed juice, fruit. The twins were gluten-free, as was Wendy, so Astrid made a small batch of gluten-free pancake batter as well. She'd never heard of children with a gluten insensitivity before the twins were born, and it wasn't that she didn't believe it. She knew some celiac people, real ones. It was just that the twins weren't it, and neither was Wendy. She was helicoptering eating disorders into existence, and Elliot wouldn't say a thing about it. He was like the family dog that showed up at meal times, tongue out and panting. Both bowls of batter sat ready on the counter, each with its own ladle. The bacon sat cooling on a long oval plate. Astrid picked up a piece and ate it with her fingers. The doorbell rang and Astrid hurried to the foyer, even though no one coming would wait for her to open the door. When she got to the door and it was still closed, she looked through the glass panel on the other side of the door and saw Bertie, with both arms wrapped around a bowl covered with plastic, the fruit salad. Astrid pulled open the door. "You're the first guest. Everyone is late." Bertie leaned in and kissed Astrid on the cheek. "Good morning." "Good morning," Astrid said, already softening. Bertie nudged Astrid back inside. "You sure you're ready?" "Ready or not, here I come. Who knows when the next school bus is coming round the bend?" They walked back into the kitchen and Bertie set the fruit salad down on the table. "Well, there are lots of ways to do it. One at a time, all at once. I came out to my parents when I was 25, even though I'm sure they'd known since I was 12. I wrote a letter, and then they wrote a letter back all about how sorry they were that I was going to go to hell, and we never spoke of it again, which was pretty good, I thought." Bertie picked up a strawberry and examined it. "Well, I think that's horrible," Astrid said. "I'm going to tell them all at once, and they can cry or rend their clothes if they want to, but then it'll be done and we'll have pancakes." She shivered, not wanting to feel nervous, but feeling it all the same. Feelings were the problem, really. If you asked her children, Astrid didn't think they would report that she had any outside of the basics, certainly not fear. Control. That's what Astrid had always had, was control of feeling. The summer light filled the kitchen with stripes of yellow banded across the hardwood floor. It would be a hot day, but it wasn't yet. Astrid and Bertie's friendship had been fast and unexpected. Bertie took over for Nancy at the hair salon 5 years ago, and Astrid could hardly believe it that Bertie and Russell had lived in the same town, that they had both touched her body, the same body. Bertie had arrived so long after Russell died that the wounds weren't even fresh. It wasn't a topic of conversation for months. Had Russell ever touched her head? He had given foot massages. He had touched her body. He had touched her cheeks, but Astrid couldn't remember her husband ever touching her hair, maybe to push it out of the way on a windy day. She couldn't remember. It had been so long that she didn't feel sad anymore about the things that she'd forgotten. Astrid remembered what she remembered, and that was enough. The doorbell rang again and Astrid jumped. "I'll get it," Cecilia called, running down the stairs. She pulled open the door and Elliot's boys ran inside without a moment's pause, each of them wielding a large plastic sword. The boys weren't identical, but Wendy had somehow kept them dressed in nearly identical clothing every day of their lives, and it took slowing both children to a complete halt and holding them side by side in order to tell which was which. Wendy put a Z and an A on the toes of their sneakers, which they then sometimes swapped, just to mess with their minders. "Hi," Wendy said, stepping over the doormat. "Sorry, hi." She had a heavy-looking nylon bag on each shoulder. "Thanks, and don't worry, I'll catch them." Cecilia scampered off after the boys, happy to have actual targets for her energy. Elliot followed Wendy into the kitchen. They were both in their weekend attire, which meant chino shorts with belts and polo shirts. They could golf at a moment's notice like rich superheroes. "Hi, Mom," Elliot said, and gave Astrid a dispassionate kiss on the cheek. He looked at Bertie, who was standing behind Astrid, and paused. "Bertie?" he said. "Good to see you." "I get my hair cut at Rhinebeck," Wendy said, apologizing, as she had every time she'd been in the same room as Bertie, as if Bertie's job required a follicle confession. "I've been going to my person forever." Wendy had been at the top of her class in college and then the top of her law school class. After the twins, she'd gone back to work part-time at a law firm in New Paltz, but her specialty, corporate law, had been downgraded to small businesses, and Astrid knew that it did not fill her with fire and passion. Her most successful client was a man who owned most of the Hudson Valley's Dairy Queens. "That's okay," Bertie said. "They're doing a great job. Your hair looks terrific. So full. It's hard after childbirth. Most women lose a lot of volume. Wendy looked pleased. It's expensive, but hey, it's worth it, right? Elliot picked an apple out of the bowl on the counter and took a big crunching bite. Your hair always looks the same. Wendy flicked him on the shoulder, her fingernails clicking against each other. It looks great, Astrid said. That's what he means. There was a knock at the door, and then Porter opened it, holding more food. Some clap-happy cheese, of course, and probably a nice crusty loaf of bread. Astrid liked things prepared, things with ingredients and recipes, but everything that Porter cooked or made was, what did they call it now? Rustic. Porter ate all her meals out of a giant bowl like one of her goats, just everything piled on top of everything else. Astrid watched her daughter wade through the bags that had been dropped by the door, the toys that Aidan and Zachary had somehow already strewn about, and one of Cecilia's shoes. Astrid felt full of love for her daughter, who had brought things and was going to stay. Bertie told Astrid that she should tell her children things like that when she had little moments of appreciation, that it was nice to know your mother thought nice things about you, even if they were tiny little things that didn't matter. Astrid had always kept tiny little things to herself, in addition to most things that weren't tiny or little at all. It was small being in love. It wasn't small being in love, and she was in love for the second time in her life. And at this point, when falling in love seemed less likely than, well, getting hit by a bus, Astrid reminded herself of that, watching Bertie fill the kettle at the sink, her dark curls lying against her neck. When they met, Bertie's hair had been mostly brown, and now it was mostly gray. Maybe all her life she'd been waiting for someone with curly hair to arrive. Everyone, I have something to say, Astrid said. Porter set her things down on the counter, and Cecilia poked her head out of the hallway. Whoa, 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 Porter said, shaking her head. She drew a line with her across her neck with her finger. Mom, don't! No, Porter, Astrid said. She wasn't in the business of telling someone else's secrets. Porter took a breath and nodded. That was something right there. She would have to remember to tell Bertie. It was an anecdote in the making, something she could tell her grandchild when she was born. Her last grandchild, no doubt. Your mother thought I was going to tell everyone about you, but Gammy would never. Elliot and Wendy were having an almost entirely silent conversation about him taking the car and her getting the boys home. No one was paying attention to her. The boys were running up the stairs shouting, "Pow, pow, pow!" Life wouldn't slow down more than this. Astrid cleared her throat and continued. Bertie and I are in a romantic relationship and have been for quite some time. And after seeing Barbara, well, I don't know. It didn't interest me to keep it from you any longer. If you have any questions, ask away. But brunch is served. So, like I say, you get a lot of a flavor of that. I really liked the characters. I liked the kids. I liked Astrid. I liked their give and take. And I loved seeing her develop as this character at 68 who was coming out to her kids and really, surprising them and sort of forcing them to see her as a human being and not just a mom. And so it's a light book. It's delightful. A really good read. Once again, that was Emma Straub's All Adults Here. Wow, that took up a lot more time than I expected. So, the other book, the other fiction book I'm going to talk about today is The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi. This is a big bestseller right now, so you may have heard of it. It's on. It was one of Reese Witherspoon's book club picks. It's a really interesting novel. Very atmospheric. Most of it is set in Jaipur, in India, and Lakshmi, who is the main character, and her name actually she took when she started working as a henna artist, and it means it's the goddess of fortune. And she has a very interesting background because she was put into an arranged marriage quite young, partly because her parents, the small town that she was from, her parents were very poor. And she did something very bad and unheard of at the time, and she took off. She left her husband after a number of years. She just left. And there was a fallout on her parents that she didn't, I think, ever really stop to think about the impact that it would have on her parents. But she ended up moving around using some of the herbal skills that have been taught to her by her mother-in-law, and she was working in a brothel and ended up learning a little bit about henna and styles of henna there, and turned out to be quite good at it. And then she ended up going to Jaipur and working with the very wealthy women there, and making a lot of money and becoming successful. So at the beginning of the book, she's in a position where she's been saving money to send a train ticket to her parents, and she's been saving up and building this house of her own design. And she is going to, she believes, she's going to bring her parents to live with her, and her parents will forgive her and be so happy to see how successful she is. And they'll forgive her for basically ruining their reputation by running away from her husband. Unfortunately, what she doesn't know, and what you find out at the very beginning of the book, because you see a little girl who's maybe 13 or 14, who's leaving the village under a cloud, and everyone hates her and thinks she's unlucky. And it turns out that after she ran away from her husband, her parents had another daughter. And this daughter is, because she didn't really communicate with her parents, Lakshmi had no idea she has a little sister, and she also has no idea that her parents died. And so the story goes on to talk about the relationship that happens when her little sister manages to find her in Jaipur, and they start working together. And it's very interesting, the dynamics that happen, and how Lakshmi has to change from the way that she's always been. It's a very interesting story. It's well written. It's got a lot about the caste system in India, so you know a little bit about, you find out a little bit about, you know, which level people are at, and what that means. At any rate, I'll read you a little bit out of that. Parvati was at her rosewood desk. She checked her slim gold wristwatch before returning to the letter she was writing. A stickler for punctuality, she hated tardiness in others. I, however, was used to waiting while she dashed off a note to Nehruji or finished a phone call with a member of the Indo-Soviet League. I set down my tiffins and arranged the cushions on Parvati's cream silk divan while she sealed her letter and called for Lala. Instead of the old servant, Lala's niece appeared. She kept her large dark eyes on the floor and her hands clasped in front of her. Parvati's eyebrows gathered together in a frown. She considered the girl and, after the briefest of pauses, said, "There will be a guest for lunch. Make sure we have the bundi raita." The girl blanched and looked as if she might be sick. There's no fresh yogurt, Mem Sahib." "Why not?" The girl shifted uneasily. Her eyes searched for an answer in the Turkish carpet, the framed photo of the Prime Minister, the mirrored cocktail cabinet. When Parvati spoke, her words were glass, clear and sharp. "Make sure there is bundi raita for lunch." The girl's lower lip trembled. She looked imploringly at me. I moved to the windows overlooking the back garden. Parvati was my mistress too, and I could no more help the girl than could the tiger skin mounted on the wall. Today, have Lala bring the tea. Parvati dismissed the girl and eased herself into the divan. Now I could begin her henna. I took my customary seat on the other end of the chaise and took her hands in mine. Before I came to Jaipur, my ladies relied on the women of the Shudra caste to henna their hands and feet. But the low-caste Shudra women painted what their mothers had before them, simple dots, dashes, triangles, just enough to earn their meager income. My patterns were more intricate. They told stories of the women I served. My henna paste was finer and silkier than the mixture the Shudra women used. I took care to rub a lemon and sugar lotion into my lady's skin before applying the henna so the imprint would last for weeks. The darker the henna, the more a woman was loved by her husband, or so my clients believed, and my rich cinnamon designs never disappointed. Over time, my clients had come to believe that my henna could bring back wayward husbands to their beds or coax a baby from their wombs. Because of this, I could name a price 10 times higher than the Shudra women and receive it. Even Parvati credited her younger son's birth to my henna skills. She had been my first client in Jaipur. When she conceived, I saw the pages of my appointment book fill up with the ladies of her acquaintance, the elite of Jaipur. Now, as the henna on her hands was drying and I began drawing on her feet, Parvati bent forward to observe until our heads were almost touching, her breath sweet with the scent of betel nut. Her warm sigh grazed my cheek. "You tell me you've never been outside India, but I've only seen this fig leaf in Istanbul." My breath caught, and for an instant the old fear came over me. On Parvati's feet I had drawn the leaves of the Turkish fig tree, so different from its Rajasthani cousin, the banyan, the miserly fruit of which was fit only for birds. On her soles, intended for a husband's eyes alone, I was painting a large fig, plump and sensual, split in half. I smiled as I met her eyes and pressed her shoulder back gently onto the cushions of the divan. Arching a brow, I said, "Is that what your husband will notice? That the figs are Turkish?" I pulled a mirror from my satchel and held it to the arch of her right foot so she could see the tiny wasp I painted next to the fig. "Your husband surely knows that every fig requires a special wasp to fertilize the flower deep inside." Her brows rose in surprise. Her lips stained a deep plum parted. She laughed a lusty roar that shook the divan. Parvati was a handsome woman with shapely eyes and a generous mouth, the top lip plumper than the bottom. Her jewel-colored saris like fuchsia silk she wore today brightened her complexion. She wiped the corners of her eyes with the end of her sari. "Shabash, Lakshmi," she said. "Always on the days you've done my henna, Samir can't stay away from my bed." Her voice carried the hint of an afternoon spent on cool cotton sheets, her husband's thighs warm against hers. With an effort, I banished the image from my mind. "As it should be," I murmured, before resuming my work on her arch, a sensitive spot on most women, but she was used to my ministrations and managed never to shake my reed. She chuckled. "So the Turkish fig leaves remain a mystery, as do your blue eyes and fair skin." In the 10 years I'd been serving her, Parvati had not let this matter rest. India was a land of coal-black irises. Blue eyes demanded an explanation. Did I have a sordid past? A European father? Or, even worse, an Anglo-Indian mother? I was 30 years old, born during British rule, and used to aspersions being cast on my parentage. I never let Parvi's comments provoke me. I draped a wet cloth over the henna paste and poured some clove oil from a bottle onto my palm. I rubbed my palms together to warm the oil, then reached for her hands to rub off the dried henna paste. "Consider, G, that an ancestor of mine might have been seduced by Marco Polo or Alexander the Great." As I massaged her fingers, flakes of dried henna paste fell onto the towel below. The design I'd painted on her hands began to emerge. "Like you, I may have warrior blood running through my veins." Oh, Lakshmi, be serious. So it's a very interesting story what happens just between her and these women that she serves, and her very carefully constructed business, and how having her sister that she never knew existed come into that sort of changes everything, and the dynamics that result and where she ends up at the end of the story. But it was a lovely story, very lyrical writing, and I really would recommend it. Once again, that was The Henna Artist, and that's by Alka Joshi. So the last book I'm going to talk about is really was just so much fun. It's nonfiction, but it's Mythos by Stephen Fry. So if any of you know Stephen Fry, I'm a huge fan. He is a British actor and comedian that's been involved in a lot of, in Blackadder, and he used to have a show with Hugh Laurie, A Bit of Fry and Laurie, which is very funny. And he's written a lot of memoir type books, and he's just got a wonderful sense of humor. He's brilliant. He just really uses words so beautifully. And I, as a child, was a huge fan of all types of mythology, and a book of Greek mythology was one of the first books that I ever read once I learned to read. So this is a wonderful retelling of Greek mythology. This is a bit of an older book, but I hadn't read it, so I read it because this year, or just at the end of last year, he wrote a second book of Greek myths called Heroes. So Heroes just came out recently, but Mythos is more about the gods and starts sort of at the beginning, and then Heroes is more the heroes. So it's really lovely. I listened to it on audiobook, and the audiobook is read by Stephen Fry himself, so it has all of that wonderful humor, and he has a great voice for it, and it's just a wonderful read. It reminds me a little bit of that the Norse myths that Neil Gaiman wrote a number of years back. That was also great, but I think the Mythos is a little bit funnier just because of who Stephen Fry is. So I'm just going to read a little bit out from one of my favorite Greek myths is the myth of Eros and Psyche. So Eros is the son of Aphrodite. He's Cupid, basically. And this story of him falling in love for the first time with Psyche is a great myth. Not a lot of people are that familiar with it, and that's a shame. I would say that the story of Beauty and the Beast steals quite heavily from Eros and Psyche. And I'm going to read you a bit from it, and if you want to finish it and read the rest, because this is quite a lengthy story, I would really recommend getting this book, either in audiobook or in print. Both of them are a lot of fun. Once upon a time, in a land whose name is now lost to us, lived a king and queen and their 3 beautiful daughters. We will call the king Aristides, and the queen Damaris. The 2 eldest girls, Calanthe and Zona, were lovely enough to be admired everywhere. But the youngest, whose name was Psyche, was so entirely beautiful that many in the kingdom abandoned the cult of Aphrodite and worshipped this young girl in her place. Aphrodite was a jealous and vengeful goddess and could bear no rivalry, least of all from a mortal. She summoned her son Eros. "I want you to find a pig," she said to him, "the ugliest and hairiest in all the land. Go to the place where Psyche lives, shoot your arrow into her, and make sure that the pig is the first thing she sees." Used to his mother's charming ways, Eros set off on his errand cheerfully enough. He bought an especially bristly and foul-smelling boar from a swineherd who lived not far from the palace, and led it that evening to the window of the room where Psyche slept. More clumsily than you might imagine of a slim, athletic god, he tried to clamber through the window with the pig under his arm without making any noise. A number of things happened very quickly. Eros landed safely in the moonlit room. Psyche slumbered peacefully on. Eros wedged the pig firmly between his thighs. Eros reached behind his shoulder to pluck an arrow from his quiver. The pig squealed. A flustered Eros scratched his own arm with the point of his arrow as he drew the bow. Psyche woke up with a start and lit a candle. Eros saw Psyche and fell deeply in love with her. What a business! The god of love himself love-struck. You might imagine that the next thing he would do is fire an arrow at Psyche and that all would end happily. But here, Eros comes out of the story rather well. So real, pure, and absolute was his love that he could not think of cheating Psyche out of her own choice. He took one last longing look at her, turned, and leapt out of the window and back into the night. Psyche saw the pig running in wild, snuffling circles on her bedroom floor, concluded that she must be dreaming, blew out the candle, and went back to sleep. The next morning, King Aristides was alarmed to be told by a servant that his youngest daughter seemed to have turned her bedroom into some kind of piggery. He and Queen Damaris had been worried enough already that, unlike her sisters Calanthe and Zona, who had allied themselves to rich landowners, Psyche had stubbornly refused to marry. The news that she was now consorting with pigs made up his mind. He traveled to the oracle of Apollo to find out what the girl's future might be. After the correct sacrifices and prayers had been offered up, the Sibyl made this answer: "Garland your child with flowers, and carry her to a high place. Lay her on a rock. The one that will come to take her for its bride is the most dangerous being of earth, sky, or water. All the gods of Olympus fear its power. So it is ordained, so it must be. Fail in this, and the creature will lay waste all your kingdom, and discord and despair shall come in its train. You, Aristides, will be called the destroyer of your people's happiness." 10 days later, a strange procession wound its way out of the town. Carried high on a litter festooned with flowers and dressed in the purest white, sat a gloomy but resigned Psyche. She had been told of the oracle's pronouncement and had accepted it. Her so-called beauty had always been a source of irritation to her. She hated the fuss and stir it caused, how oddly it made people behave in her presence, and how freakish and set apart it made her feel. She had planned never to marry, but if she had to, then a rapacious beast would be no worse than a tedious, fawning prince with mooncalf eyes. The agony of its intentions would at least be over quickly. With piteous wails of grief and sorrow, the crowd labored up the mountainside until they came to the great basalt rock on which Psyche was to be laid for sacrifice. Her mother Damaris howled, shrieked, and sobbed. King Aristides patted her hand and wished himself elsewhere. Calanthe and Zona, their dull, elderly but rich husbands at their sides, each tried their best to conceal the deep satisfaction they felt at the knowledge that they would soon be the unchallenged fairest in the land. As she was bound to the rock, Psyche closed her eyes and breathed deeply, waiting for everyone to have done with indulging in their lamentations and shows of grief. Soon, all the suffering and pain would be over. So, if you have not already read that story and you don't know what happens and how Eros manages to get her and make her fall in love with him too, I would really recommend getting this book. The whole beginning of it, all about the birth of the gods and everything, it's just really told in a funny, sort of easy to read way, and I would really recommend it as just a light escape, and it's nicely set so that you can read a separate story each day, or you can just get it through audiobook. So thank you all for tuning in. Like I said at the very beginning, if you weren't here at the beginning to hear it, we likely won't be doing a physical tea and books until the new year, 2021. So we will be continuing our Tea and Books online for a while. So the next one, I believe, is October 1st. Yes, so October 1st will be our next one. So until then, right below, tell me what books you're reading now, or tell me about any of the books that we've talked about in Tea and Books that you might have enjoyed, and we'll see you again soon.